The railroad cars screech to a grinding halt under the merciless Texas sun, steel wheels throwing sparks against the tracks as dust clouds swirl around Camp Hearne like desert ghosts. June 4th, 1943. The temperature is already climbing past 95 degrees, and it's not even noon. 19-year-old Heino Erichsen stumbles from the cattle car, his legs barely supporting his dysentery-weakened frame. His Afrika Korps uniform hangs loose on his gaunt shoulders. The same uniform he'd worn with pride just months ago in Tunisia, before Rommel's forces crumbled under Allied bombardment. Now it's little more than sweat-stained rags, marking him as Hitler's defeated soldier. In his trembling hands, he clutches an empty Wehrmacht mess tin, its metal surface scarred from countless meals of watery turnip soup and mystery meat that barely qualified as food. Behind him, 1,850 other German prisoners emerge, blinking into the blazing sunlight. Officers, enlisted men, even 4 generals who once commanded thousands. They march in formation down Railroad Street in Mexia, their boots raising small dust devils with each step, while entire families line the sidewalks to stare at these exotic enemies who've somehow materialized in rural Texas. Erichsen's mind races with the propaganda he'd absorbed since age 10, when he'd been forced into Hitler's Young Volk. Americans were supposed to be weak, soft, decadent people who threw away perfectly good resources while the superior German race built a 1,000-year Reich. The Führer himself had declared that America's mongrel population could never match Germanic discipline and efficiency. Yet here he stands on American soil, not as a conqueror, but as a captive. The irony cuts deeper than any battlefield wound. As they're herded through Camp Hearne's gates, past the double rows of barbed wire and guard towers, Erichsen catches glimpses of something that makes no sense. American soldiers casually smoking real cigarettes, not the ersatz tobacco made from oak leaves that German troops had been rationing since 1942. Guards drinking what appears to be actual coffee, the rich aroma carrying on the hot wind. Most shocking of all, he watches an American cook scrape what looks like perfectly good food into a waste bin. Food being thrown away. The thought is so alien that Erichsen wonders if the dysentery is making him hallucinate. Back home in Germany, his mother had written about eating roof pigs, cats raised in rooftop cages because all other meat had vanished from civilian rations. His younger sister had mentioned the new bread made from sawdust and acorn flour, how it tasted like eating tree bark, but at least filled the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. And here, in the heart of enemy territory, Americans are throwing food away? What else had the Nazi propaganda gotten wrong? What other lies had shaped his understanding of this war, this enemy, this strange new world where he now finds himself? Imprisoned? As the barracks doors slam shut behind him, one question burns in Heino Erichsen's mind like the Texas heat itself. What would these next months reveal about the America he'd been taught to hate, and about the Germany he'd been raised to love? To understand the shock that would soon shatter every belief these German prisoners held about America, you have to first grasp the reality they'd left behind in Hitler's crumbling empire. By 1943, Germany was a nation slowly starving itself to feed its war machine, and these men carried those memories of deprivation like invisible shrapnel in their souls. Wehrmacht field rations in 1943 told the story of an empire running on empty. Each soldier received 25 ounces of Graubrot, gray rye bread that grew grittier and more ersatz with each passing month as real wheat became precious as gold. The canned meat portions had shrunk to 6 ounces on good days, 10 if they were lucky, and the contents grew increasingly mysterious as Germany's livestock herds disappeared into the hungry maws of earlier campaigns. Heino Erichsen remembered the Erbswurst, compressed soup pellets that dissolved into watery broth when dropped into boiling water. 1 minute later, and the instant soup was ready to eat, Wehrmacht manuals promised. But they didn't mention how it tasted like salted cardboard or how it left your stomach cramping with emptiness 30 minutes later. The ersatz coffee, made from roasted acorns and chickpeas, provided no caffeine, no comfort, just bitter liquid that mocked the memory of real coffee beans. But the soldiers' rations were luxury compared to what their families endured back home. Letters from Germany painted a picture of systematic starvation that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. Civilian rations had plummeted to 200 calories daily, barely enough to keep a grown man alive, let alone working in the factories that fed Hitler's war machine. Bread now contained sawdust, potato peels, and ground chestnuts. Real sugar had vanished completely, replaced with saccharin that left a metallic aftertaste of desperation. Most heartbreaking were the stories of Dachschwein, roof pigs. German families, driven by hunger that gnawed at their very souls, had begun raising cats in makeshift rooftop cages, fattening them for the dinner table. Children who once played with pets now eyed them as potential meals. The psychological toll was devastating. Humanity itself seemed to be rotting away along with the Reich's food supplies. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, where many of these Camp Hearne prisoners had served, Wehrmacht units had begun slaughtering their horses for meat. Tens of thousands of cavalry mounts that had carried German forces across Poland and into Russia were now being butchered in desperate attempts to stave off starvation. Soldiers wrote letters home describing the awful choice between feeding artillery horses or feeding themselves, knowing that either decision meant death for someone. The Nazi propaganda machine had promised these men that such sacrifices would bring victory over the decadent Americans who threw away food while the master race tightened its belt with discipline. German soldiers were told that Americans were so weak and wasteful that they couldn't possibly sustain a real war effort. They have no stomach for prolonged fighting, officers assured their troops. Their mongrel population lacks the racial purity necessary for true military discipline. This propaganda wasn't just political rhetoric, it was psychological armor that helped German soldiers endure unimaginable hardships. When you're eating horse meat and drinking acorn coffee, it's easier to bear the suffering if you believe your enemy is even weaker, even more desperate. The idea that Americans were soft and unprepared for sacrifice gave meaning to German sacrifice. But now, marching through the gates of Camp Hearne, cracks were already appearing in that carefully constructed worldview. These German prisoners had expected harsh treatment, beatings, starvation rations, forced labor that would make Wehrmacht conditions look pleasant by comparison. After all, that's how German forces treated enemy prisoners, especially on the Eastern Front, where Soviet POWs received barely 2,200 calories daily and died by the millions from deliberate starvation. Instead, American guards were explaining something called the Geneva Convention, treating them with a casual professionalism that seemed almost incomprehensible. No screaming, no summary executions, no immediate assignment to death camps or slave labor details, just methodical processing, medical examinations, and assignment to barracks that looked comfortable. The confusion deepened when they learned about American military rations. U.S. soldiers were receiving 4,000 calories daily, nearly double what Wehrmacht troops got, even in the best of times. American K rations contained real chocolate, actual coffee, canned meat that looked and smelled like food rather than mysterious paste. The abundance seemed almost obscene to men who'd watched their own comrades grow hollow-eyed with hunger. But perhaps most unsettling was the attitude of their captors. American soldiers complained about their own food, actually complained about having to eat the same meal 2 days in a row, or grumbled about coffee that wasn't fresh enough. The casual waste that Erichsen had glimpsed at the gates turned out to be systematic. Americans routinely threw away food that German civilians would have killed for. As evening approached, on that first day at Camp Hearne, whispers spread through the barracks in hushed German. Some prisoners clung desperately to Nazi ideology, insisting this apparent abundance was an elaborate trick designed to weaken their resolve. "They're trying to make us forget we're soldiers of the Reich," muttered the hardliners, men like those who would later murder Hugo Kraus for showing too much friendliness toward American captors. But others, like young Heino Erichsen, felt something cracking deep inside their carefully constructed understanding of the world. If Americans could afford to throw away food while Germans ate cats, what did that say about the master race's supposed superiority? If the enemy could feed prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers, what did that reveal about the Reich's true strength? The questions multiplied like cracks in breaking ice. Tomorrow would bring their first meal in American captivity, and nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared these battle-hardened veterans for what they were about to discover about the nation they'd been taught to despise. The mess hall doors swing open at 0600 hours, and the aroma hits the German prisoners like a physical blow to their malnourished senses. Real coffee. Not the bitter acorn brew they'd choked down for months, but actual coffee with a rich, robust smell that makes their empty stomachs clench with involuntary hunger. Steam rises from industrial-sized cooking vats, carrying scents of frying bacon, fresh eggs, and something that seems impossible: real meat, sizzling and crackling with genuine fat. Heino Erichsen clutches his mess tin with trembling hands as he shuffles forward in the breakfast line, his dysentery-weakened legs barely supporting him. Around him, 1,850 other Afrika Korps veterans move like men walking through a fever dream, their hollow eyes fixed on the impossible abundance stretching before them. The American cook, a cheerful sergeant from Oklahoma who treats this like any other morning routine, begins loading Erichsen's tin with portions that defy everything he knows about wartime rationing. First comes a mound of scrambled eggs, real eggs with bright yellow yolks that have seen actual sunlight rather than the gray powder German troops had been receiving since 1942. Then strips of bacon, still sizzling with grease that spatters and pops like tiny fireworks of abundance. "Coffee?" the sergeant asks in English, gesturing toward a massive urn that seems to contain enough real coffee for an entire Wehrmacht battalion. Erichsen can only nod, speechless, as his cup fills with liquid that actually smells like the coffee he remembered from childhood before the war turned everything into ersatz substitutes and bitter compromises. But the sergeant isn't finished. Next comes fresh bread. Not the gray, sawdust-laden Graubrot that had become standard throughout the Reich, but actual white bread with a crust that crackles when you touch it. Then a pat of real butter, yellow as summer sunshine, followed by jam made from real fruit rather than artificial flavoring and beet sugar. The German officer behind Erichsen, a major who'd commanded artillery units in Tunisia, starts to weep. Not the quiet tears of defeat, but the devastating sobs of a man whose entire understanding of reality is crumbling with each additional spoonful of abundance. "Mein Gott," he whispers in German, "Mein Gott, what have we done?" As the prisoners find seats at long wooden tables, conversations buzz in hushed, disbelieving tones. A sergeant from Munich calculates the calories on his plate. Easily 1,500 for breakfast alone, more than many German civilians received in an entire day. A corporal from Hamburg stares at his bacon, remembering the last letter from his wife describing how she'd traded her wedding ring for a single egg to feed their sick daughter. "This has to be propaganda," insists SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Weber, one of the Nazi hardliners who would later organize Hugo Kraus's murder. They're trying to weaken our resolve with this decadent display. Real German soldiers don't need such excess. But even as he speaks, his own hands shake as he tears into the white bread with desperate hunger. The psychological impact is immediate and devastating. These men have spent months, sometimes years, accepting starvation as a noble sacrifice for the fatherland. They've been told that their suffering proved German racial superiority, that only the master race possessed the discipline to endure hardship while their enemies wallowed in weakness. The Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as soft, undisciplined people who would collapse at the first sign of real adversity. But here, in the heart of enemy territory, they're experiencing abundance beyond their wildest dreams while knowing their own families are eating cats and sawdust bread. The cognitive dissonance is almost unbearable. Young Erichsen takes his first sip of real coffee and feels something fundamental shift inside his worldview. The liquid is hot, rich, perfectly sweetened with real sugar, not saccharin or honey substitute, but actual sugar that dissolves on his tongue like crystallized luxury. He remembers his mother's last letter, how she'd written about saving coffee grounds for the third brewing, then drying them to mix with acorn flour for bread. And here, American guards are pouring fresh coffee from seemingly endless supplies. The breaking point comes when prisoners notice American soldiers casually scraping leftover food into waste bins. Perfectly good eggs, untouched strips of bacon, half-eaten slices of bread, all thrown away without a second thought. The waste is so casual, so routine, that it becomes clear this isn't a special display for propaganda purposes. This is simply how Americans eat. Every day, as a matter of course. A Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Müller suddenly stands up, his chair clattering backward as he points at a garbage bin filling with discarded food. "Verdammte Scheiße!" he shouts, lapsing into the kind of profanity that would have earned him disciplinary action in Wehrmacht ranks. They throw away more food than my entire squadron has seen in months. The emotional explosions are immediate and varied. Some prisoners weep openly, overwhelmed by the sudden relief of full stomachs after months of gnawing hunger. Others rage against the unfairness. How can the enemy eat like kings while German children starve? A few simply sit in stunned silence, mechanically chewing food their minds cannot quite accept as real. But the most dangerous reactions come from the Nazi true believers, the SS officers and party loyalists who see this abundance as a direct attack on everything they've sacrificed for. To them, accepting American generosity isn't just eating a meal, it's betraying the ideology that gave meaning to their suffering. Hugo Kraus, a 25-year-old corporal who speaks fluent English thanks to his American relatives, makes the fatal mistake of expressing gratitude out loud. "Perhaps we were wrong about these people," he says to a small group gathered around his table. "They treat us better than our own officers treated Russian prisoners." The words carry clearly across the mess hall, and Erichsen watches several SS officers exchange dark looks. In the rigid hierarchy of Nazi ideology, Kraus has just committed treason by suggesting that German racial superiority might be a lie. By acknowledging American humanity, he's questioning the very foundation of everything these hardliners have killed and died for. The atmosphere in the barracks that night crackles with ideological tension. Hardliners organize whispered meetings, planning to maintain discipline and prevent racial contamination from American generosity. They speak of duty, of honor, of maintaining pure German spirit even in captivity. But their words ring hollow against the memory of full stomachs and the promise of tomorrow's meals. Meanwhile, other prisoners like Erichsen lie awake staring at the ceiling, their worldviews fragmenting like glass under pressure. If Americans can feed enemy prisoners better than Germany feeds its own soldiers, what does that say about the Reich's true strength? If the master race is eating sawdust while their inferior enemies feast on steak, who exactly is superior to whom? The transformation isn't just physical, though the steady weight gain and improved health will be dramatic over the coming months. It's psychological, spiritual, existential. Men who entered Camp Hearne as fanatical believers in Nazi ideology are discovering that their enemies possess something Germany has lost: the simple human decency to feed the hungry, even when those hungry mouths belong to men who came to kill them. As midnight approaches, the sound of approaching footsteps echoes through the barracks. Hugo Kraus, the English-speaking corporal who dared to suggest German fallibility, is about to pay the ultimate price for his honesty. But his murder will only accelerate the ideological fracturing already spreading through the camp like cracks in a breaking dam. Because once you've tasted real abundance, once you've experienced genuine human dignity from those you were taught to hate, there's no going back to the comfortable lies that made starvation bearable. The Nazi propaganda that sustained these men through months of suffering is crumbling with each American meal, each small act of unexpected kindness, each casual display of the prosperity that makes throwing away food seem normal rather than criminal. The war may not be over, but for many of these prisoners, the battle for their souls has just been decided by bacon, eggs, and real coffee served with simple human decency. The murder of Hugo Kraus 3 nights later sends shockwaves through Camp Hearne that will reverberate far beyond the Texas barbed wire. Nazi hardliners beat the English-speaking corporal to death in his bunk while Erichsen sleeps just feet away, his dreams haunted by the sounds of muffled violence and ideological rage. But rather than reasserting German discipline, the killing exposes the desperate futility of trying to maintain Nazi purity in the face of American abundance. By December 1943, the psychological transformation is undeniable. German prisoners who arrived as hollow-eyed believers in Aryan superiority are gaining weight, learning English, and asking questions that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. They're receiving 3,500 to 4,000 calories daily, while letters from home describe families reduced to eating tree bark and boiled leather. The contrast becomes impossible to ignore, impossible to rationalize away with propaganda about racial superiority and enemy weakness. The irony cuts deeper with each passing month. While Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front slaughter their horses for meat and survive on Erbswurst soup made from compressed peas and artificial flavoring, their captured comrades in Texas are complaining about having fried chicken 2 nights in a row. American abundance isn't just defeating German ideology, it's accidentally creating what historians would later call schools of democracy, where enemy soldiers learn about freedom through full stomachs and human dignity. Heino Erichsen's transformation exemplifies the broader change sweeping through Camp Hearne. The 19-year-old who arrived clutching an empty mess tin and Nazi certainties gradually evolves into a young man questioning everything he'd been taught about racial superiority, national destiny, and the nature of strength itself. He learns English from American guards who treat him like a human being rather than a member of an inferior race. He discovers that weakness isn't measured by kindness, that strength doesn't require cruelty, and that the most powerful nation on earth can afford to feed its enemies better than Germany feeds its own children. The psychological impact extends far beyond individual prisoners. Of the 425,000 German POWs held in America during World War II, thousands choose to remain after the war rather than return to the rubble and starvation awaiting them in the defeated Reich. They become farmers, businessmen, engineers, contributing to the same American prosperity that first shattered their Nazi worldview in mess halls across Texas, Louisiana, and dozens of other states. Many who do return to Germany carry with them a radically different understanding of what democracy can achieve. They become leaders in post-war reconstruction, advocating for the same abundance and human dignity they experienced as prisoners. The Marshall Plan finds eager partners among former POWs who've already seen how American generosity can transform enemies into allies through simple acts of decency. But perhaps the most profound impact lies in what Camp Hearne reveals about the true nature of victory in ideological warfare. American military leaders never intended to create democratic converts through abundance. They were simply following Geneva Convention requirements and drawing on their nation's agricultural surplus. Yet this accidental generosity achieved something that years of bombing and battlefield victories could not. It demonstrated the superiority of democratic values not through force, but through the simple act of feeding the hungry. The lesson resonates powerfully in our current era of global conflict and ideological division. In a world where extremist groups recruit followers by promising meaning through sacrifice and suffering, the Camp Hearne story suggests an alternative approach. Sometimes the most effective weapon against fanaticism isn't bombs or bullets, but bacon and eggs served with basic human respect. Heino Erichsen, who eventually became an American citizen and lived just 90 minutes from Camp Hearne until his death in recent years, captured this transformation perfectly in his memoir. I learned the meaning of freedom in a prison camp. I never knew what America was like before I was a prisoner. His words echo the experience of thousands of German POWs who discovered that their enemies possessed something Nazi Germany had lost: the simple prosperity that comes from treating human beings with dignity rather than ideological categories. The empty mess tin that Erichsen carried into Camp Hearne became a symbol of everything Nazi ideology couldn't provide: abundance, generosity, and the quiet confidence of a nation so secure in its values that it could afford to feed its enemies steak while their own armies starved on sawdust bread. That's the true power of American strength. Not the ability to destroy, but the capacity to transform hatred into hope, one meal at a time. Ready to uncover more hidden stories of World War II? Subscribe now and hit that notification bell, because history's most powerful lessons often come from the most unexpected places, like a prison camp in Texas, where enemies became Americans through the simple act of sharing a meal.